What would you do if the whole world expected you to stay quiet about what you believe? Well, Mel Gibson faced that exact moment, and what he said left everyone stunned. This isn't just a story about Hollywood. It's a story about courage, faith, and standing your ground when it matters most. The auditorium of Stanton University, one of the most prestigious Ivy League schools in the country, buzzed with a low, expectant murmur. Students, professors, journalists, and influencers filled every seat, their eyes fixed on the stage where Mel Gibson sat quietly, adjusting his cuff as he waited for the panel to begin. The event, Faith, Art, and Modern Culture, A Conversation with Mel Gibson, had been marketed as a bold dialogue about creativity, belief, and the state of modern society. Yet, as Mel glanced around the room, he could feel the unspoken tension lingering beneath the polished exterior. It wasn't just curiosity that brought many of them here. It was expectation. Bright lights poured down from overhead, casting sharp angles on the sleek panel table, where name cards and microphones were neatly arranged. At the center, Mel's name stood out, a name both revered and controversial in Hollywood circles. His latest film, Resurrection, was already making waves, and everyone knew this event was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Off to the side, Dr. Sandra Whitmore, a respected theology professor and the panel's moderator, reviewed her notes, glancing occasionally toward Mel. In the front row sat Ethan Kross, a sharp-dressed political commentator with a reputation for provocative questions, and Mel noticed him immediately. The atmosphere in the room was thick, charged with anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something explosive, and though Mel had sat on countless stages before, something about today felt different. A storm was coming, and he could feel it in the air. The panel began with a warm welcome from Dr. Sandra Whitmore, who leaned into the microphone and offered a practiced smile. "We're honored to have Mr. Gibson with us today," she began, her voice calm and composed. His latest film, Resurrection, has already stirred conversations across artistic and faith communities alike. So, let's start by asking, what inspired this story? Mel leaned forward, adjusting the microphone slightly, offering a polite smile that disarmed some of the tension in the room. "Well, it's a story I've wanted to tell for a long time," he said, his voice steady but relaxed. "It's about sacrifice, about redemption, about things that actually matter, not just the noise that fills our world these days." A few students in the front row nodded thoughtfully, while others furiously typed into their laptops, capturing every word. Sandra followed up with a softer question about the challenges of directing a film with such heavy spiritual themes. "You've done historical epics before, but Resurrection feels different, more personal. Was it?" Mel smiled, pausing for a moment before answering. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. You can't make a film about something like resurrection unless you believe it means something. Otherwise, you're just wasting everyone's time." His casual but earnest response drew a small ripple of laughter from the audience, the first moment where the tension in the room seemed to ease. A few more light questions followed, focusing on the cast, production, and how Mel had approached retelling such a monumental story. He answered each one easily, slipping into his role as seasoned filmmaker, giving the audience thoughtful answers mixed with dry humor. But even as he spoke, Mel could feel Ethan Kross's gaze locked on him, unblinking, calculating. The real challenge hadn't started yet, but it was coming. As the panel continued, the atmosphere grew more comfortable, with laughter and applause filling the space after each of Mel's witty responses. Yet beneath the surface, the tension lingered, especially as Mel noticed Ethan Kross sitting near the front, arms casually folded, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Every now and then, Ethan would glance around the room, as if gauging the right moment to strike, and Mel knew it was coming. Finally, after a round of questions from students and a polite inquiry from a local reporter, Dr. Sandra Whitmore glanced toward Ethan, offering a gracious nod. "I think Mr. Kross had a question," she said, her voice remaining even, though Mel caught a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. Ethan stood slowly, adjusting the sleeves of his designer jacket, taking his time to approach the microphone. His posture was relaxed, but Mel could see the calculated sharpness in his eyes. This wasn't going to be a friendly question. The room grew quiet as students leaned forward, journalists raised their phones to capture video, and others simply watched, sensing that the tone was about to shift. "Mr. Gibson," Ethan began, voice smooth and almost overly polite. "First of all, congratulations on the film. It's clear a lot of effort went into it." He paused, offering a thin smile. "But I wanted to ask something a bit more timely." His eyes gleamed as he locked on Mel. "In a world that's moving toward inclusivity, progress, and leaving behind outdated traditions," Ethan continued, "do you really think Christianity, a faith that has caused so much division, violence, and exclusion throughout history, still has a place? Or are we perhaps better off moving beyond belief systems that have, frankly, done a lot of damage?" The room went dead silent, like every ounce of air had been sucked out. The students stopped typing. Phones lifted a little higher. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances, while others leaned in, clearly eager to hear Mel's response. Even Sandra tensed, folding her hands tighter around her notepad. Mel sat still, hands resting calmly on the table, expression unreadable. The bait was obvious, the kind of question meant to provoke, to create headlines, to get a fiery reaction. Everyone in the room expected him to fire back or get defensive, maybe even lash out the way tabloids love to portray him. But Mel didn't move, didn't frown, didn't show a flicker of anger. Instead, he simply watched Ethan, studying him like a chess player assessing an opponent's bold move. His fingers tapped the side of his water bottle once, twice, slowly. The entire room held its breath, waiting. The room remained frozen as Mel leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once more against his water bottle before he slowly unscrewed the cap and took a sip. There was no rush, no hint of defensiveness, only deliberate calm. He set the bottle back down carefully, his gaze still fixed on Ethan, who stood confidently at the mic, waiting for the fireworks he expected. But instead of snapping back, Mel smiled, not the media-trained, polite smile, but something slower, sharper. A smile that signaled he wasn't about to play by the rules Ethan had set. "You know," Mel began, his voice even, steady enough that it forced people to lean in to catch every word. "I've been in this business, and this life, long enough to recognize when a question isn't a question." His eyes stayed locked on Ethan, but the words were for the entire room. "That wasn't curiosity, that was a setup. And I've had my fair share of setups." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through a few corners of the room, but most sat still, watching. Mel leaned forward slightly now, elbows resting on the table, his tone still calm but gaining weight with each word. "You asked me if Christianity has a place in a modern world, if it's outdated, divisive, if we should move beyond it. And honestly, that's a strange thing to ask when we live in a world that feels more broken, more divided, and more desperate for meaning than ever before." He paused for a moment, letting that settle, scanning the room. "You say faith has caused division, and sure, people have used it as a weapon, but here's the thing, people will use anything to divide, politics, race, money, gender. It's not faith that divides us, it's people, and blaming faith, blaming Christianity, for human failure is a cheap way to avoid looking in the mirror." A murmur moved through the audience. This wasn't the answer they had expected. Mel's gaze didn't waver. "You want to know if Christianity is outdated? Compared to what exactly? Compared to a culture that celebrates greed and selfishness? A world where everyone's chasing after their own truth while ignoring basic decency and compassion?" The tension in the room was thick now. Ethan shifted, but Mel wasn't done. His voice remained steady, but his words were sharp as glass. "See, the real problem today isn't that people believe in something, it's that people believe in nothing. We've built a culture where we mock faith, we tear down anything that stands for something bigger than ourselves, and we call that progress." The words hung heavy in the air, and even those who had been eager to see Mel fail were now silent, caught in the gravity of what was being said. "And let me say this," Mel continued, voice softening but losing none of its force. "I've been mocked, attacked, judged for my beliefs, and I'm fine with that. But what I'm not fine with is pretending that truth doesn't matter just to keep people comfortable." He sat back a little, glancing around the room. You can say Christianity is offensive, outdated. You can say faith has no place today, but you know what? The truth doesn't need permission to be true. And if that truth makes people uncomfortable, that's not my problem. That's theirs. Mel picked up his water bottle again, twisting the cap back on slowly as a deep silence filled the room, one heavier than before, the silence of people realizing they had witnessed something real, something raw and unapologetic. He glanced once more at Ethan, whose smirk had all but vanished, and offered a small, final nod. Next question? The moment Mel Gibson finished speaking, the entire auditorium seemed to hold its collective breath as if no one dared to move or speak. The weight of his words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Ethan Cross, who had delivered his question with smug confidence only minutes before, now sat stiffly in his chair, the smirk long gone from his face. His eyes darted briefly to the cameras, clearly unsure how to salvage the moment. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and for once, the usually fast-paced world of media and debate was utterly still. From the stage, Dr. Sandra Whitmore shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. She fumbled with her note cards, glancing toward Mel as if expecting him to say more, but Mel remained calm, leaning back in his chair, completely unfazed, as if the intensity of his words hadn't just turned the entire room upside down. Finally, someone in the audience, a student near the front, began to clap quietly, the sound echoing in the tense silence. It was hesitant at first, but soon a few others joined in. Within moments, scattered applause filled the room, a mixture of support and discomfort, as others looked around, unsure whether to follow or remain still. Mel simply gave a small nod, his expression calm, resolute, as if to say, "I meant every word." And though Sandra quickly moved to shift the discussion, it was clear to everyone that the panel had just taken a turn no one would forget. It didn't take long for Mel Gibson's powerful response to ignite a firestorm far beyond the walls of the university auditorium. Before the event had even officially ended, clips of Mel's answer were already hitting social media. A 2-minute video shot from a student's phone was uploaded to Twitter with the caption, "Mel Gibson just destroyed a loaded question about Christianity. Must watch." Within minutes, the video began to explode. Tens of thousands of views, then hundreds of thousands. Comment sections lit up, a mix of praise and outrage. Hashtags like Mel Gibson Truth, Faith in Hollywood, and Cancel Mel began trending as debates erupted across platforms. Some called it one of the boldest defenses of Christianity ever seen from a Hollywood figure, while others labeled it dangerous, outdated, and divisive. Supporters flooded in, praising Mel for having the courage to say what many felt was unspeakable in today's culture. "Finally, someone standing up for faith in a world trying to erase it," one user wrote. Another tweeted, "Mel Gibson just proved that standing for truth is still possible in Hollywood. Respect." Churches, pastors, and faith-based influencers began sharing the clip, turning it into a rallying cry about faith and conviction. But critics were just as loud. Prominent voices in media and Hollywood slammed Mel, calling his response aggressively tone-deaf and another example of why faith should stay out of art. Late-night talk show hosts picked up the moment quickly, splicing Mel's clip into their monologues. Mel Gibson defending Christianity like it's a sequel to Braveheart nobody asked for, one joked, earning laughs from the studio audience. The film studio behind Resurrection quickly issued a statement, walking a fine line. "We recognize that Mr. Gibson's views are his own and do not reflect the entire team involved in this project. We are committed to fostering inclusive conversations that respect all perspectives." Yet, as the video soared past 1 million views by nightfall, it was clear this moment was bigger than a PR challenge. It had become a national conversation about faith, freedom of speech, and the cost of conviction in the public eye. By the time Mel Gibson returned home that evening, the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm raging online. From his quiet ranch, tucked away from Hollywood's glare, he stood on his back porch, arms folded, watching the last streaks of sunlight disappear behind the hills. His phone, resting on the table beside him, buzzed relentlessly. Calls from his agent, texts from reporters, emails from studio execs, but for now Mel let them go unanswered, the sheer weight of it all pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew this moment would come the minute he chose to answer Ethan's question directly, but knowing it was coming didn't make it easier. His agent, Tom, had left 3 increasingly urgent voicemails. "Mel, we need to get ahead of this. Call me back ASAP. The studio's panicking. They're talking about delaying the release of Resurrection. Call me now." Yet Mel stayed quiet, staring out into the growing dark, knowing full well what Hollywood expected him to do. Apologize, backtrack, make a carefully crafted statement that would make the controversy disappear. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Rachel, his assistant, stepped out onto the porch holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said gently, placing it on the table. "No return address." Mel opened it slowly, revealing a small handwritten note. "Thank you for not backing down." The ink was smudged, but the message was clear. Mel exhaled deeply, running a hand over his beard. For all the noise, there were still people who understood. People who needed someone to say what others were too afraid to speak aloud. As the night settled around him, Mel leaned back in his chair, finally picking up his phone. But instead of dialing his agent, he turned the screen off and stared into the sky. Because some truths are worth standing for, even when the whole world demands your silence. In the days that followed, the ripple effect of Mel Gibson's words spread far beyond social media debates and entertainment headlines. Across the country, churches played clips of his response during Sunday sermons, praising his courage to speak truth in a world where faith often gets mocked or ignored. Small-town newspapers ran editorials, not about Mel the celebrity, but about the deeper question he raised: the cost of conviction in modern culture. Even some who didn't fully agree with Mel's faith found themselves admiring the courage it took to stand alone on such a public stage. At the same time, the backlash remained fierce. Several brands began quietly pulling their partnerships, and talk shows and pundits kept spinning his words, twisting them into narratives he hadn't intended. Yet in private messages to his team, ordinary people flooded in with words of support. Parents, pastors, teachers, students, people who had felt silenced for their beliefs now found a voice in his stand. Mel's aha moment at that university wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a cultural flashpoint, a reminder that in a world desperate to push faith aside, one voice, spoken with courage, can still spark a conversation that reaches places no one expected. And for those watching, it was a challenge. If he could stand, maybe they could too. As the noise of the controversy continued to swirl, Mel Gibson sat quietly on his porch, watching the sunrise over the hills, a soft reminder that life goes on even when the world feels on fire. He knew there would be a cost for what he said: lost deals, angry headlines, friends in Hollywood keeping their distance. But as he sipped his coffee and listened to the morning birds, he also knew he wouldn't have changed a word. For too long, Mel had watched people in his industry stay silent to protect their careers, to avoid being labeled controversial. But he also knew that silence comes with its own price, the cost of betraying your own convictions. As he thought back to that packed university hall, to the stunned faces in the crowd, he realized what truly mattered wasn't the approval of critics or studios. It was reaching the people who felt like their beliefs no longer had a place. Maybe he wasn't just standing for himself, but for all of them. Looking out over the quiet land, Mel smiled faintly, accepting both the battle and the peace that came with speaking truth. Because in the end, some things are worth standing for, even when the world tells you to sit down. And that, he knew, was the kind of conviction that could never be silenced. The story of Mel Gibson's bold stand reminds us of a powerful lesson. True conviction has a cost. But staying silent often costs even more. In a world where people are quick to judge, cancel, or tear down anyone who dares to stand firm in their beliefs, Mel's response was a reminder that truth doesn't need permission to be spoken. His calm, unwavering defense of faith in a culture that often mocks it showed that real strength isn't about shouting louder, it's about speaking clearly, courageously, and without apology. Though he knew backlash would come, and it did, Mel also knew that by speaking up, he was giving a voice to countless others who feel pressured into silence. The lesson here is that integrity and courage are more important than public approval. Whether you're on a public stage or having a private conversation, there will come a moment when you must choose between standing for what you believe or going along to avoid discomfort. And when that moment comes, remember, the world doesn't need more silence, it needs people willing to stand up for truth no matter the cost.